Welcome back, guys. We're going to take a look here. I want to talk about our check cells. So I want to talk about why our check cells are important and why they should be positive and why they might be negative. Okay, so these are check cells. We put them into the tube after we've done an indirect antiglobulin test or direct antiglobulin test to verify that our anti-IgG, our AHG, our Coombs reagent is working properly. So we'll talk about that. I know I threw out quite a few terms there, and so we'll define these here real quick. So check cells, you're also going to hear maybe some of us old fogies call them Coombs cells, our check cells, and this is a reagent. They're usually labeled check cells now, but what they are is they have red blood cells in them, and they have red blood cells in the tube that is already sensitized with IgG antibodies. Okay, so these cells, we buy them, and they have IgG antibodies all over them. So they are already sensitized red blood cells in a vial as a reagent. Okay, so these are our check cells, our control cells. Maybe you'll hear someone say control cells. I know it gets frustrating when you're working and there's so many different names for the same thing. So when we perform testing in blood bank, and specifically when we are using the AHG reagent, okay, so this is our AHG reagent, so this is our anti-human globulin reagent. This is, again, you might hear someone call it Coombs reagent. Maybe there's two B's, two O's. I'm not sure exactly how they were spelling Coombs reagent. Okay, but those are some terms. And what this reagent essentially is, what's in this vial, okay, we have this little vial, and it is colored green, which is why I try to use that when we make the videos. Okay, these are antibodies that are specifically made to be against the IgG protein. Okay, so these are anti-IgG. So remember, our antibodies are made up of proteins. So it's just not these letters. It really looks like this type of Y protein. Okay, and we call it IgG, but it is made up of proteins, and it looks like this. Looks very similar, okay? And so what we've done is we've made another antibody that is specific to it. Okay, so this one now will attach to a different antibody. Okay, so I had one student say one time, it's an antibody to an antibody. And as crazy as it sounds, that is completely true. Okay? Because we have to remember our antibodies are actually protein molecules. Okay? So it's an antibody to this specific protein molecule. Now, it's not specific to any type, so it's just any IgG. Okay, so it will react, and this is where I keep trying to focus you or help you remember. If we have an antibody, you and I produce a lot of antibodies, and so we have antibodies to, here's my chickenpox antibody. Okay. Here's an example of my influenza antibody. Okay. We make antibodies also to mononucleosis or EBV when we were exposed to it. So we have a lot of proteins and antibodies floating around in our plasma. So when we do this test and we add the patient's plasma up here, okay, we're going to add these 2 drops into our tube with, for this one, we're just going to call them screening cells. Okay, we'll say these are screening cell 1. Okay, we're adding other antibodies in there. So in that plasma, we have, here's my little, that I already mentioned, there's my funny chicken pox, my flu antibody. And here's some alloantibodies to the red blood cells. Okay, so they're all mixed in there together. The other thing that's in there is, what other things do we have in our plasma? We have glucose, for example. We have TSH. So we have other hormones in there. Okay, so there are other proteins, other substances floating around in our plasma when we're performing this test. So stay with me here. Let's put these 2 drops into our test tube. And I want you to see here the antibodies, the alloantibodies that are going to react to these red blood cells are attaching right here. And so you can see that they're sensitizing these in the tube. That's why this is an indirect antiglobulin test, not a direct. Okay, so we got them all over there. We do an immediate spin, and we even incubate this with some enhancement media so that they're going to attach more readily. But the other thing that we put in here, we cannot forget. Here's my chickenpox antibodies floating around, and I've got a lot of them. Okay. I just got my flu vaccine, so I've got really good antibodies to this flu virus going around. I had EBV years ago, so that's in here. Probably not quite as many. My titer's a little lower for that, so to speak. Okay? Those are all floating around in there. These are not, these ones up here are not attaching to the red blood cells because they're not specific to it. Okay? Follow me on that one? So they're just floating around in there. So after we incubate for the 37 degrees for 15 to 30, maybe 60 minutes, depending on whether you have enhancement media or not, you're going to centrifuge it, look for agglutination. After that phase, this is when we wash. Okay. Whoops. Let me change here. Now we want to wash. Okay. Now when we wash, we want to wash 3 times 3. What we're doing when we're washing is removing these unbound antibodies from our test tube. Okay? So we'll wash those away. And under normal circumstances, we do a really good job with our wash, and they all go away. And that's what we want to see. Now, after that wash is done, we're going to add the AHG. Okay. So we'll come over here, we'll get our 2 drops right here. We'll put that in our tube, mix it up, centrifuge it, and that AHG will then bridge these red blood cells, forming that lattice network, and we can see agglutination. Now, what could possibly happen is if we didn't wash well enough, and that's one of our issues. They say we didn't wash very well. If we didn't wash very well and get rid of all of those other antibodies in here, all my chickenpox, all my influenza, my EBV, and so forth, if we didn't get all of those out of there and we add the AHG, that AHG, those anti-IgG antibodies are going to bind to these guys. Now, if all of our AHG antibodies, our anti-IgG antibodies, bind to these free-floating antibodies instead of binding down here, I'm going to get a false negative reaction. okay? We do not want a false negative reaction, right? We're in blood bank. We want to make sure we do this as accurately as possible. So because we want to make sure that we don't have a false negative, what we're going to do is add these check cells. So what's occurring now when we add our check cells, and we only add them to negative tubes, okay? We don't need to add them to a positive because we saw the reaction, okay? What happens is if we don't wash well enough, we get a false negative. So we need to check that negative and make sure it's not a false negative. So what's happening and what we want to occur is if we have a negative tube, we didn't have any antibodies attaching to our red blood cells. Okay? So you see, we just have red blood cells. There was no alloantibody that reacted to it. We added our AHG, our anti-IgG, okay? Anti-IgG, and it has nothing to bind to, right? And we properly washed, so there's none of those extraneous proteins in there to neutralize that reagent. So now when we add our check cells right here, so we're going to put those in there now. Now when we add those, there's sensitized cells with antibodies on them for them to react to. So this is also why we don't see great positive reactions either. So we have these on here, okay? And we're seeing now some clumping. But we're also still have these negative ones in here as well. So see, these guys didn't have, oops, I wanted to highlight that, I'm sorry. We still have these negative ones in here. There were no antibodies on them, okay? So there's not going to be any reaction. So we added this reagent, and I'll duplicate a few of these. Oops. I gotta get it. Uh-oh. I'll just draw them. That'll be easier. Undo. So we have what's essentially a mixed field reaction in here, okay? Because we have some of these negative ones, and then we have the control cells agglutinating. So this is never a really pretty positive reaction, so to speak. But we should be getting, around 1 to 2 plus. 2 plus is really the best reaction that you want to see for your check cells. But that's why we're doing the check cells. And that's why up here, okay, if we don't wash appropriately, that's why we're getting this false negative, because we have those leftover plasma proteins, those plasma antibodies in there that neutralized. So what it did is it neutralized, whoops, having trouble with my pen today. It neutralized that reagent, and that's what led to that false negative. Okay? So it's important that we get this 2 plus. And if you don't get this 2 plus with your check cells, you have to repeat the test, okay? Because it is an invalid result. Okay? All right. That's our check cells in a nutshell. Thanks a lot, guys. Signing out.